People ask me sometimes what it was like the first time she spoke. I never know where to start. I could start with the day I walked into her hull and the lights came on. I could start with the morning the salvage crew found me sleeping on the docking collar and decided I was too strange to keep. I could start further back, with the courtyard in Wren Station where my father left me with a bag that wasn't quite full and a jacket that wasn't quite warm and a look on his face like he was already 2 steps gone before his feet had moved. But I think, honestly, I have to start with my grandmother. Because she is the reason any of it happened. She is the reason the unspoken woke up. She's been dead for 3 years, and she's the whole story, which is the sort of thing I've learned to accept, without trying to explain it. Her name was Sella Wynne. She was a barge hand on the Havre transit lane, and, before that she was a barge hand on the approach loop to the old ore platform at Careth Point, and before that she was whatever her mother had been, which was something to do with water reclamation, on a station I've never found on any map. What she was to me was the only person who ever talked to me like the talking mattered. Not like it was instruction or warning or management, but like words were a thread and she was keeping it from going slack. She was a small woman, my grandmother. She had hands that were larger than you expected for her frame, from years of rope work and grip handles, and the particular kind of labor that doesn't look hard until you see the hands it makes. She had the quality some people develop from long practice of solitude, not loneliness, which is different, but solitude. A comfort with one's own company that makes the presence of other people something you choose rather than something you require. I wanted to be like her. I was trying at 16 and failing mostly, but trying. Every night before she slept, she would say something to the dark, not a prayer. She didn't believe in anything organized enough to be called a god. Just a few words, spoken into whatever corner of the room was darkest. Sometimes it was about the day, what she'd seen, what had tired her, what she was grateful for. Sometimes it was nothing more than a greeting. Hello, dark. I'm still here. Thank you for holding still. When I was young and living with her on the Careth Point platform, I would sometimes lie awake and listen to her do it in the next room. It was quiet enough that I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, which was neither solemn nor casual but something in between, tone of someone who has found the proper register for a particular practice and settled into it. She never rushed it. She never sounded performative. It was as natural as setting down a cup at the end of the day. I asked her once who she was talking to. She thought about it for a long time. Long enough that I assumed she'd decided not to answer. I watched her profile in the dim light from the corridor. The line of her jaw, the way her eyes moved without focusing on anything in the room, the slight forward tilt of her head that meant she was taking something seriously. Then she said, someone who's been listening longer than I've been alive. I don't know their name. I just know that something out there learned to pay attention to us a very long time ago, and I'm not going to be the one who stops. I was 9. I thought she was poetic in the way old women sometimes are. Beautiful and a little sad and not entirely meant to be taken literally. I smiled and went to sleep. After she died, I started doing it myself. I don't know why. Grief takes root in strange soil. First time I said anything to the dark, I felt foolish. And the second time less foolish. And by the third time, it was just something I did the way I washed my hands. Not because I expected a particular result, just because it was the shape of the evening now. It kept her present in a way that didn't hurt the way other forms of memory hurt. It was active, passive. It required something from me, which meant she required something from me, which meant she was not entirely gone. Hello, dark. I'm still here. My father didn't understand grief. He understood logistics. When my grandmother died and left him with me, and the bills she'd been quietly absorbing for years, he ran the numbers and I came up short. He told me he loved me in the way people say things they need to be true. And then he left me in the Wren station, processing courtyard, with the bag and the jacket, and an account with enough credit to last 4 months. If I careful. I was 15. The courtyard in Wren Station smells like recycled air and machine oil and the particular sharp undertone of cold metal every transit station develops after 20 years of use. I sat on a bench with my bag between my feet for 3 hours after he left, watching the transit cycles move, their freight and their passengers. because I didn't know what else to do, and because sitting on the bench required nothing of me except that I continue sitting on it, which felt achievable. Then I got up and found the workboard and started reading. I was careful. The 4 months became 8 because I found work on a waste sort platform, and then on a transit loader, and then as a runner's errand hand on a scrap salvage rig called the Cinderhound, captained by a woman named Merritt Oss, who hired young people when they looked hungry enough and fired them when they looked settled. I was perpetually hungry enough. I was good at holding the quality of someone who expected to lose what they had, because I was someone who expected to lose what they had. And authenticity is difficult to imitate, precisely because it doesn't need to imitate anything. The Cinderhound worked the HFY ring. If you've never heard of the HFY ring, you've never needed to. It's not the kind of place that makes it into education packages or tour itineraries. It's what's left of a war that nobody alive remembers. Orbiting a dim star about 16 light hours off the main transit lane, a graveyard of ships so old that the Xenoarchaeological Survey team stopped making the trip 70 years ago, because there was nothing left to learn and everything was too corroded to move safely. 300 and some odd hulls, most of them less than 100 meters long. Frigates, couriers, troop carriers stripped down to framework, the kind of debris field that looks like scattered teeth from a distance, and from closer range, looks like a mausoleum that nobody bothered to roof. The light in the HFY system is different from main lane light. The star is older and cooler, and the light it gives has a blue-gray quality that makes everything look like a photograph of itself, like the world is showing you evidence rather than presence. I noticed it the first day we arrived, and it never stopped affecting me for the entire 11 days we worked there. Everything under that light had a quality of record, of something being preserved past the point of its own usefulness. And then, at the center of the field, the unspoken. Nobody named her that. She was in the survey records as Object 7 in the HFY secondary cluster, designation vessel type unknown, length estimated 870 to 910 meters, material composition analysis incomplete, condition sealed. She'd been called the ghost ship by salvagers. For as long as there had been salvagers working the ring, every crew that had ever gotten close enough to attempt entry had walked away with nothing but a headache and a uniform reluctance to talk about what they'd seen. Not that anything dramatic happened. That was the thing, nothing happened. You approached, you found no external access points in the conventional sense. You searched the hull for maybe 6 hours. You came away with the feeling that you'd been politely but absolutely excluded from something. And then you filed your report with the salvage registry and moved on to the actual scrap. The survey team's report from 60 years ago used the phrase, thoroughly inert, 4 times in 12 pages. They noted the hull material resisted all standard analysis methods. They noted the seals. And the ship was entirely seamlessly sealed, not a hatch or a joint visible on the exterior, were of unknown mechanism. They noted there was no evidence of power generation or life support or weapons systems. They concluded it was an artifact of a pre-Campac civilization, most likely the Vorath or the Jeth Kessari, and recommended leaving it alone. The demolition registry had picked it up 3 years ago. The HFY ring had been flagged for clearance. An outer system infrastructure project needed the orbit, and the insurance liability of having 900 meters of unknown composition sealed vessel in a worked area was too high to maintain indefinitely. The registry had sent 2 cutting teams in the 2 years since the flag. Both had come back with reports that essentially said, "We don't know how to cut it. The hull surface defeats all standard equipment. Recommend reclassification or alternative disposal." There was a footnote in the second team's report, added by the team lead, and clearly written late in the day when professional discretion had loosened slightly, that said, "The hull also defeats a strange quality of attention in the people working it." Everyone on the team reported the feeling of not being wanted there. Not threatened, not menaced, simply not wanted. The Cinderhound's contract was to conduct a final pre-demolition survey, catalog what could be cataloged, tag anything of potential xenoarchaeological value before the third cutting team made their attempt. That was why I was there. I want to be clear about my role. I was the errand hand. I made sure the equipment lockers were organized, and the food stocks were counted and the daily survey logs were filed on time. I tracked the parts inventory and the suit integrity schedule and the communication windows. I was not a technician or an archaeologist or a demolition specialist. I was a 16-year-old who was good at being organized and quiet. And Merit Oss kept me because organized and quiet was a harder combination to find than it sounded, and because she had the instinct. She told me this later, once, in a moment of unusual directness, that I was the kind of person who became useful. In exactly the situations where other people became useless, I didn't feel useful. I felt like what I was. A kid running out of reasons for anyone to keep him around, trying to extend the current arrangement by doing the current job better than it had ever needed to be done. The Havera ring in person is nothing like a photograph. In photographs, it looks like what it is: a debris field, old metal, and dark. In person, there is a quality to the silence that doesn't exist anywhere else I've been. It's not that the ring is quiet in any measurable way. There are always small sounds: the tick of thermally stressed metal, the low hum of the Cinderhound's own systems, the occasional distant percussion of micro-debris impact absorbed by the hull, so that the space feels occupied. Like, whatever used to be here left an impression in the physics of the place, the way a body leaves an impression in a mattress. Not haunted. I want to resist that word, because haunted implies something unresolved, something seeking, and the feeling in the ring was the opposite. It was resolved. Everything that happened here was done. Whatever was here had been here, and now it was quiet, and the quiet was the permanent state of the place. Except for the ship at the center, quiet around the unspoken was different. It was the quiet of something that was holding its breath. We'd been working the ring for 11 days when we reached her. The rest of the hulls had gone quickly, small enough to photograph in full in a day, close enough to documented vessel types that our xenoarchaeological rating system could process them. The unspoken was the last item on the survey manifest, and it had its own annotation in the registry. Advise caution, prior crew reports attached. Do not attempt forced entry. Merit read the prior crew reports twice and then set them aside with the look she always wore when she'd decided something was going to be annoying, rather than dangerous. It's a hull survey, she said. Exterior only. We log the dimensions, photograph the surface, and note any change in condition since the last team. 6 hours. When you're on equipment and log. Torres and Helk take the exterior pass. Supervise. That was the assignment. Exterior only. I was to stay at the equipment station, on the docking collar we'd extended from the Cinderhound's port side, close enough to the hull to take readings, far enough to be easily extracted if something changed. I was not supposed to go inside. The first 4 hours were entirely unremarkable. Torres and Helk completed the exterior pass. 904 meters of seamlessly sealed black hull, no visible hatches, no access points, no apparent change in surface condition from the prior team's records. The material still defeated composition analysis. The hull temperature was 11 degrees above ambient, which was noted as unusual but consistent with prior reports. Nothing new. I did my job. I logged the readings. I managed the equipment. I ate a ration bar around hour 3 and drank cold tea and stood in the blue-gray light the Havera star provided this far out, looking at the side of the ship. The hull was not featureless, exactly. There were patterns in the surface, not decoration, or not obviously decoration. More like the grain in very dense, very old wood, if wood could be black and smooth and resistant to every instrument you pointed at it. Curves that ran the length of the ship and folded back on themselves. Not randomly, but with the logic of something that had been designed to carry meaning even when the meaning couldn't be read. I'd been staring at it for hours. Something about the patterns was easier to look at than I expected. Not beautiful exactly, but not threatening. Familiar, almost, which made no sense, because I had never in my life been within 100 light years of this ship before 11 days ago. And yet, I kept coming back to the word familiar, and not finding a better one. Not the familiarity of something I'd seen, the familiarity of something I'd been told about, without knowing I was being told. The way a landscape you've never visited can feel like a landscape from a dream. Not because you've been there, because something about its shapes was already somewhere inside you. At hour 4, Marit called a break. Turris and Helk came back inside the Cinderhound for food and warmth. Mert told me to hold the collar station and ran a systems check on the Cinderhound's own survey array. I was alone at the equipment station. 20 meters of extended collar between me and the Cinderhound's hull, 40 meters of umbilical tether space between the collar's end and the black hull of the Unspoken. I stood there in the silence of the Hevara ring. It was cold. I'd been standing for 4 hours. I was thinking about nothing in particular. About the survey log. About whether we'd make the transit window back to the main lane. About a conversation I'd overheard between Turaz and Helk the previous night that they found me strange and somewhat off-putting in a way they couldn't quite articulate, which was not new information, but was still the kind of thing that sets in your chest like a small, cold stone. And I did what I always did when I was cold and alone, and it was late in the cycle. I spoke to the dark, not loudly. I wasn't performing anything. My grandmother did it softly, and I'd inherited her softness about it. Just enough volume to make words. The suit's external mic would have picked it up if anyone had been monitoring. But no one was monitoring. The ship's hull was 40 meters away. There was no one to hear it but vacuum in the cold. "Hello," I said. "I don't know if this is the dark you'd count, being out here in vacuum. Suppose it's all connected. I'm still here. Barely, some days, but here." I stopped. The patterns on the Unspoken's hull lit up. Not all at once. Not in a way that resembled a power system activating from outside. I've seen power-up sequences on a dozen salvaged vessels, and they always have a quality of sequence, of circuit, of designed ignition order. This was different. It was the way ice melts on a warm surface. Not from a single point outward, but from everywhere at once. At a speed that seemed tied to something other than electricity. The light didn't jump. It arrived. The light was the color of old bronze left out in clear weather. Warm, not orange. Something between gold and brass and the particular color of sunlight through thin cloud. It traced the patterns I'd been for 4 hours, and they became, in an instant, obviously language, obviously meaningful. I don't mean I could read it. I couldn't. I mean the way a face becomes obvious the moment you stop looking at its parts. The moment it resolves, you can't unsee it. The patterns had always been language. I'd been looking at language for 4 hours and couldn't read it. And now it was lit. And the fact that it was language was no longer something to be argued about. The hull opened. Not the hull. I want to be precise about this. No seam appeared. No section retracted or swung outward. The hull surface, at a point exactly level with my chest, 40 meters away, I was looking directly at it, became permeable. I can't think of a better word. It went from solid to open the way a voice goes from silence to sound. And where solid had been there was now an entryway, a corridor, a threshold of pale bronze light leading inward. I should have called Maret immediately. I called Maret immediately. "The hull opened," I said into the comm. There was a pause. "What?" "The hull opened. There's an entry point. The patterns lit up. And then there was an opening. It's about 1.5 meters wide, right in front of the collar end." Another pause. I could hear, in the background, the sound of Maret setting something down with the deliberate care of someone who has just been told something that requires both hands to be free to deal with. Then, "Don't move. I'm coming to the collar." I didn't move. I stood very still and looked at the opening and at the light inside it. The light wasn't static. It pulsed slowly at a rhythm I couldn't help noticing felt like breath. Not fast, not mechanical. Pace of something very large, doing the thing it does when it is waiting. Not impatient waiting. Patient waiting, which is different. Patience of something that is already demonstrated. It can wait. Marit came through the collar hatch 40 seconds later. Then Turaz and Helk behind her. All 3 of them stopped when they saw the opening. I watched their faces. Helk's went through surprise, and then a studied blankness that was his default when he didn't know how to process something. Turaz made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Maret's face did the careful person thing. It stilled, went precise, started working. She stared at the entry point for a long time. Then she looked at me. "What did you do?" she said. "Nothing. I said something to it. Out loud. To it specifically. It's something I do. Talk to the dark." The look Turas and Helk exchanged confirmed everything they'd thought about me. Marit turned back to the opening. She was a careful person. Not cautious in the way of someone who was afraid, careful the way a craftsperson is careful. She assessed things honestly. She didn't add or subtract. She held what was there. Prior reports said nothing like this happened, she said. 4 survey teams, 2 cutting teams. Nobody reported an entry point appearing. I know. What exactly did you say? I told her. Word for word, she looked at me for a moment, and the expression on her face was one I hadn't seen on her before. Not quite suspicion, and not quite wonder. Something in between, the expression of a person who has held the world's strangeness at arm's length for many years by being rigorous and thorough, and has now encountered something that is both rigorous and thorough and entirely inexplicable. Turas, she said, call the demolitions registry. Tell them we need a 72-hour hold on the clearance order. We have an active access event and we are not authorized to proceed until they view the status. Helk, begin recording everything from this point forward. Win. She stopped, looked at the entryway, then back at me. Stay where you are until I've conferred with the registry. I stayed where I was. The 72-hour hold period was the strangest of my life to that point, which is saying something given what came before. Moret conferred with the demolition registry, which conferred with the Xenoarchaeological Authority, which issued a temporary suspension of the clearance order, and dispatched a review team that was 6 days out. During that time, the entry point remained open. Tourists stopped finding excuses to be near the collar station, which I understood. Helk became fascinated with the recording log in a way that kept him professionally busy and personally at a safe distance. Marit went quiet in the way she went quiet when she was thinking very hard, and the quality of the silence she produced was different from the usual end-of-day quiet on the Cinderhound. Marit sent a small survey drone through on the second day. The drone returned 12 hours later. Its recording system had captured 18 hours of footage. It had traveled much farther into the ship than its range should have allowed, as if the ship itself had carried it, or guided it, or simply declined to impede it. Footage showed corridors of the same ceramic material as the exterior hull, all lit with the bronze light. No machinery visible, no crew quarters, nothing that resembled operational systems in any form a technician would recognize. Just corridors, and at the center of each corridor, at intervals, closer together as the drone went deeper, the same patterns as the hull exterior. The language glowing quietly, patient, waiting to be read by someone who could read it. The drone's telemetry had recorded one anomaly. Approximately 4 minutes, in the middle of its journey, the drone's external microphone had registered a sound it couldn't classify. The sound analysis software gave up after 6 processing attempts and logged it as acoustic event type unknown source. Interior probable cause. Unknown. When I listened to it on the playback, it didn't sound like machinery. It didn't sound like structure settling, or atmosphere recycling, or any thermal process or anything with a mechanical cause. It sounded like someone acknowledging that they had heard something. Low, brief. Not a word, not language, just acknowledgement. The way a person makes a sound when they've been addressed across a room and are indicating, without words, that they're aware, that they heard, that they will respond when they're ready. Merritt played it 3 times. Then she turned the recording off and sat in the Cinderhound's small observation room with her hands flat on the console surface and her eyes on the viewport, where the bronze light at the entry of the unspoken was visible as a warm point in the gray field. She looked at me and said nothing. The nothing she said was the loudest thing anyone said to me in those 3 days. On the 3rd day of the hold, she called me into her office. It was a small room as they all were on working salvage ships. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelving rack with binders and rolled charts, and the careful accumulation of a working life. She had a photograph on the shelf, which I'd noticed when I joined the crew and never looked at closely. I looked at it now, waiting for her to start. A younger Merritt, standing with a hand on the hull of a ship I didn't recognize, looking at the camera with the straight-on expression of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The review team is 3 days out, she said. Once they arrive, this becomes their jurisdiction. Everything that happened here goes into the official record. There will be interviews. There may be an extended investigation before they permit entry. She paused. If they permit entry, I understand. They're going to ask how the entry point appeared. I'm going to give them an accurate account. I know. She looked at the surface of her desk for a moment. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly. She didn't look up. Have you been in contact with anyone connected to this ship or this sector before this survey? Any prior knowledge, any prior contact, anything that a reasonable person would call premeditated? No, I said. Any reason this ship should respond to you specifically? No, I said. And then, because she was asking me directly and deserved a direct answer in full, not that I know of. She held my eyes for a long moment. Quality of her attention was the quality of someone who was very good at knowing when they were being lied to, and the quality of her silence after my answer was the quality of someone who had determined they weren't. All right, she said. 3 more days. That night, on the 3rd day of the hold, I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for me. I'd slept badly since my father left me in the Wren station courtyard, in the way that people sleep badly when the only thing they're sure of is that the next crisis is a matter of when, not whether. But this was different. This wasn't the low-level vigilance of the unmoored. This was something pulling the way a tide pulls. Not painful, not frightening, but insistent in a way that could not be ignored and could not be reasoned with. It wasn't urgency. It was more like the feeling of a question that has been waiting a long time for the conditions to be right, and has now determined that the conditions are right. I got up at the 2nd hour of the sleep cycle, when the Cinderhound was quiet, and the duty rotation had Turas on watch, and Turas on watch meant the observation lounge was empty, and the corridor to the collar hatch was unmonitored. I put on my working suit. I went to the collar hatch. The entry point was still open. The bronze light was still pulsing. I want to say I was afraid. I think I should have been afraid. And there was something in me that registered the size of what I was doing. The absurdity of it. A 16-year-old abandoned errand hand with no credentials and no authorization walking alone into a 900-meter vessel that had been sealed 60,000 years and had opened for no one but him. There was something that knew that was enormous. There was something that knew that the review team was 3 days out, and Moret would be furious, and Turas would probably lose his watch. Certification for not monitoring the collar access. And I was about to make my situation considerably more complicated than it needed to be. But underneath the knowing was the pull. And underneath the pull was something older still. Something that felt, and I'm aware how this sounds, like recognition, not of the ship. I didn't know the ship. It was the recognition of returning to something you didn't know you'd left. The recognition that the place you're standing is a place you've been going toward for a very long time, and the last steps always feel obvious once you're taking them. I went in. The corridor was warm, not body temperature warm, warmer than that, the way a stone is warm after a long day of sun. A warmth that comes from being held rather than heated. The bronze light was softer from inside than it had appeared from the collar. Less a single color now and more a quality of light. The kind of light that makes you feel seen without being exposed. I walked for a long time, or what felt like a long time. The corridor didn't branch. It was a single path, and I followed it, and the patterns on the walls moved alongside me. Moved. I need to be careful with that word. They didn't animate the way recorded images animate. They shifted, the way water shifts when a stone is dropped in it. Ripples that had no source point. Or rather, a source point that was me. That was my passage through the corridor. As if the ship were paying attention to the fact of my movement, to each step, to the particular way I was moving through the space it had made available to me. I knew it was paying attention. I'd known since the moment the hull opened. I think I'd known, in some way I couldn't have articulated, from the moment I first looked at the hull patterns in those first hours of the exterior survey, and thought familiar. The corridor ended in a space. I use that word carefully, because room is too small and chamber is too human and hall is too architectural. A space the ship had made for this purpose. I understood that without being told. Roughly circular, maybe 30 meters across, the ceiling high enough that the bronze light above me had a quality of sky rather than ceiling. The same patterns on every surface, all of them moving with the same attending quality I'd felt in the corridor. At the center of the space there was no furniture, no installation, no object. Just a point where the light was slightly denser, slightly warmer. The way a fire is warmer at its center, even when you're close enough. Feel the whole of it. I walked to it. I stood in it. The warmth was like being held by something that had been very patient about it. Not aggressive, not claiming, just present, just here. I did what I always did. Hello, I said. I'm Dale Wynn. I'm 16 years old. I work on a salvage ship and I have a contract that runs out in 7 weeks, and I don't know what comes after that. I paused. My grandmother used to do this, and her grandmother before her. And I don't know how far back it goes, but it goes back a long way, further than I can see. She said someone out there had learned to pay attention to us a very long time ago, and she wasn't going to be the one who stopped. I stopped. The light breathed. I don't know if you're the same one she was talking to. Don't know if there's one or many, or what this even is. I'm just here, I said. Still here. The ship spoke. I have tried many times since that night to describe what it sounded like. The best I have managed is this. It sounded like language that had been waiting so long to be spoken that the speaking of it was itself a kind of arrival. Not a release, arrival, which is different. Not the exhalation of something that had been held too long, but the completion of something that had been traveling toward its destination and had now reached it. Not loud, not theatrical, not the booming voice of fiction or the cold synthetic tone of recorded systems. It was the volume and the register of a person in a quiet room, speaking to someone close enough to hear without raising their voice. You did not let me sleep. 6 words. I stood in the light and let them reach me, and for a moment I couldn't do anything except breathe. Not you woke me. Not you found me. Not welcome. You did not let me sleep. It was not a welcome, it was a report. A statement of fact carrying 60,000 years of evidence behind it. Every night, my grandmother spoke to the dark, and her mother before her, and whoever came before that, back to a time I couldn't trace, but the ship could. Every night, one human in an unbroken line had spoken into the quiet, and the ship had heard and had not fully slept. Had held itself at the edge of sleep the way a person holds at the edge of sleep when they know someone in the house is still awake, present but not active, waiting but not gone. We had not known we were doing it. That was what unmade me, standing there in the bronze light with the warmth of 60,000 years of listening surrounding me. Nobody in my line had known. My grandmother thought she was talking to something that learned to pay attention a long time ago. She was right. But the thing that learned to pay attention had a name and a hull, and 900 meters of black iron and 60,000 years of waiting behind it, and nobody had told her. Nobody had told any of us. The knowledge had seemed sussed at some point in the collapse of whatever civilization had built. This ship, in the long scattering of the people who'd made the agreement, in the uncountable ordinary days of people who did a thing because it felt right and didn't ask what it was for. We had kept the watch without knowing we were keeping it, and the ship had waited because the watch was kept. How long? I asked. The words came out steadier than I expected. How long have you been listening? The light shifted. The patterns on the walls settled into a configuration I couldn't read as text, but which somehow carried the meaning of duration, the way a very old face carries the meaning of time without stating a year, the way a worn stone step carries the meaning of the feet that wore it. Long, longer than I had a frame to hold. The civilization that built this ship had risen and collapsed and been absorbed and forgotten and become archaeology, and the archaeology had been half-lost, and the half-loss had been classified, and the classification had gathered dust, and the whole of that had happened inside the time the ship had been waiting. She'd been here when the war that made this graveyard was still within living memory. She'd been here when the first survey team approached her 60 years ago. She'd been here, holding the edge of sleep, somewhere in the outer systems, a barge hand with Tog's Taw was stark before she slept. And her mother had done the same, and none of them had stopped. They built you and left, I said, not accusingly, just placing it. The light acknowledged this, not in words. The quality of attention in the room changed slightly. The way a person's face changes when something true is said about a thing they have long understood and long been unable to address. They told someone to keep the watch, I said, didn't they? The warmth shifted. Still not a word, but the kind of confirmation that doesn't require words. The confirmation of something that has been waiting a long time to be correctly understood. They told my family, I said. The warmth increased, clear and steady. I sat down on the floor of the space, which I hadn't planned to do. My legs decided it before my mind weighed in. I sat and looked up at the bronze light above me, which had the quality of sky that I'd noticed when I entered, and which was, I realized now, intentional. The ceiling height, the quality of the light, the warmth that came from everywhere and nowhere. The ship had built this space to be sat in, to be inhabited, to be the place where a conversation could happen between very different kinds of beings across a very long gap. I was 16 years old and I had nothing. No family in any functional sense, no home, no credentials, no plan beyond the next 6 weeks of contract work. I had a bag that wasn't quite full, and a jacket that wasn't quite warm, and a grandmother 3 years dead, who had talked to the dark every night until she couldn't anymore, and who had left me one habit and one instruction, though she hadn't framed it as an instruction. I'm not going to be the one who stops. And the ship had been waiting for me, though not for me specifically. For whichever one of us came, as long as one of us came, as long as the thread of spoken words in the dark was not broken. She hadn't waited for a hero, or a bloodline of kings, or someone with power to command her. She hadn't waited for credentials or authority, or a person who understood what they were inheriting. She had waited for the last voice, in a chain of voices that stretched back to a time when her builders were alive, and the agreement between them and my ancestors was something people still remembered and named and honored. And she'd been patient with the forgetting, infinitely patient. Because the forgetting was human and inevitable, and the watch was still kept. The agreement, I understood standing there in the bronze light, was simple. It was always simple. The ship had explained nothing of it in words, and yet I understood it, the way you understand the things that have always been true about your life, once you finally see them from outside. Keep the watch. Say something to the dark every night, so I know you're still there. So I know the world I was built for hasn't ended. So I know there's still a reason to stay ready, and when one of you finally finds me, I will be here. I stayed for a long time, an hour, maybe 2. I told her about my grandmother. I told her about Wren Station. I told her about the Cinderhound, and about Moret, and about the work of the 11 days we'd spent in the ring. She didn't speak again in words, but the quality of the light shifted with the conversation the way a good listener's face shifts. Something warmer when I spoke about my grandmother, something still and patient when I described being left in the courtyard. I didn't feel pitied. I felt witnessed, which is the thing I'd needed for a long time without knowing I needed it. Eventually I stood. I smoothed my jacket. I looked at the space one more time. The light, the patterns still tracing their slow attention across the walls, the center where the warmth was densest. I'll be back, I said. The corridor lit my way out. Merritt was waiting at the collar hatch. It was 4 in the morning. Ship's time. She had clearly been awake for some part of the time I was inside, and her face had the look of a person who'd made several decisions and was waiting to tell me what they were. "How long were you in there?" she said. 2 hours, maybe a little more. "What happened?" I told her. "All of it." She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Outside the porthole, the bronze glow of the entry point was visible, patient and warm in the gray field. "She spoke," Merritt said. "Not a question." "Yes, to you specifically." "Yes." Another long silence. "I'm going to put this in the incident report," she said. "All of it, verbatim." "I know. You understand what this means for the classification review." "I think so." She looked at me for a long moment. "You should sleep," she said. "Review team is 3 days out." The review team arrived on schedule. 6 people, including 2 xenoarchaeologists, a tall, careful woman named Prin Voss, who was the lead, and a younger man named KL, whose job seemed to be writing down everything Prin said before she finished saying it. A demolition registry representative, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the proceedings went on, a legal observer, and 2 technicians carrying enough equipment to analyze the hull of a small moon. They interviewed me for 4 hours the first day, gave them an accurate account. The expression on their faces during the account was one I would become familiar with over the next several years. Professional struggle between the trained instinct to find a simpler explanation and the evidence that there wasn't one. The demolition registry representative kept asking me to confirm that I hadn't modified my suit's communications array in any way that might have produced an electromagnetic output that could, in theory, have triggered a dormant system. I confirmed it 4 times. The 5th time I confirmed it, he wrote something in his notebook that I couldn't read and didn't ask about. Prinvas asked me one question that none of the others asked. At the end of the 4 hours, she looked up from her own notes and said, "What did it sound like when she spoke?" Not the content, the sound of it. I told her what I'd told you. Language that had been waiting so long to be spoken that the speaking of it was itself an arrival. She wrote that down. Then she looked up and said simply, "Yes," as if I had confirmed something she'd been trying to put into words for a long time. They entered the unspoken as a team on the 2nd day, Thier. The entry point opened for them without incident. The ship was courteous. The corridors were lit. The patterns moved. The bronze light was present throughout. But it did not speak to them. The xenoarchaeologists took readings for 16 hours and returned with data that would take years to fully analyze, and they knew it. The look on Prinvas's face when she came back through the entry point was the look of a person who has just understood that her entire professional life had been spent preparing for something that happened this afternoon, and is now going to require the rest of her professional life to understand. The demolition clearance was suspended permanently on day 4. The Hevera ring was reclassified as a protected xenoarchaeological site of the highest designation, a classification that hadn't been applied to anything in 40 years. The Cinderhound's contract was terminated with full payment and a significant rider for the access event. Marit Oss filed the most carefully worded incensant report I have ever read, and she included my account verbatim, and she flagged it with her own notation. Narrator is a minor. Recommend formal guardian assignment and independent review of status. That notation was the most practical thing anyone did in those 2 weeks. What followed was slow and complicated in the way that official things always are. There were interviews and assessments, and a status review, and a formal documentation of my circumstances that used the word abandoned 4 times in 3 pages, which I didn't find comfortable, but recognized as accurate. There was a legal determination about what I was and wasn't entitled to. Took longer than it should have because I was a minor with no guardian and no clear institutional affiliation. And the situation didn't fit the existing frameworks in any straightforward way. There was an ongoing question about my relationship to the ship, which nobody could fully categorize because I couldn't fully explain it, and the categories available didn't have a slot for it. Not ownership, crew assignment, not heritage claim in the legal sense, because the legal sense required documentation I didn't have. I was assigned a formal guardian, a compact legal officer named Doss, who was professionally bewildered by the situation, but personally decent, and who made sure I was fed and housed and attended the formal hearings with someone in my corner. The hearings, when they came, about what the ship's response to me constituted. The review team had documented the access event thoroughly. The xenoarchaeological data supported a vessel that had exhibited selective response to a specific individual and had produced a vocal output of apparent communicative intent in an unknown language that matched patterns in the interior inscriptions. The demolition registry representative's theory about electromagnetic suit modification had been formally disproven by the Cinderhound's own equipment logs, which showed no anomalous output from my suit at any point during the survey. What the hearings couldn't answer, because I couldn't answer it, was the lineage question. Was there a traceable line of custody between whatever people had originally made the arrangement with the ship and my grandmother and me? Was I the inheritor of a 60,000-year-old compact? And if so, what did that compact entail? And what rights, if any, did it confer? I couldn't trace the lineage past 4 generations. The records before that became fragmentary and then absent, lost in the way that the records of working-class outer system families are always lost. Not destroyed, just never kept with enough precision to survive. There was no document saying my ancestors had made an agreement with the builders of the unspoken. There was no name in my family history that matched any of the civilizations associated with the Hevera ring. There was only the ship's response to me, the opening of the hull, the bronze light, the 6 words. And there was my grandmother's voice. I could still hear clearly. The soft certainty of it, the absence of doubt, the long habit of speaking to the dark, as if the dark were worth addressing. I told the hearings this. I didn't frame it as evidence in the legal sense. I told them because they asked me to tell them everything I knew, and this was everything I knew. The final determination of the Compact Historical Preservation Authority was, characteristically, compromise that satisfied no one entirely and covered the practical ground. The ship was designated a protected heritage site of the highest classification. No demolition, no commercial access, no unauthorized entry. Permanent research presence would be established. And I was granted a formal designation as the site's primary access liaison, a title created for the occasion which had never existed before and which meant in practice. When the ship responds to a person, that person is you, and when the research teams need to put a question to her, they bring it to you to ask. I was not given ownership. I was not declared her captain or her keeper in any legal sense. What I was given was the formal acknowledgement of what I had always been, without knowing it. The last voice in the chain, the one who talked to the dark. I'm 23 now. I've been the liaison for 6 years. First teams have changed twice over, as academic appointments tend to. Prinvas retired 2 years ago. At her retirement dinner, she gave a speech she said was the first honest speech of her career. Because it was the first time, she was allowed to say publicly that the most significant discovery she'd ever made was something she still didn't fully understand, and that she'd made her peace with that, and that she suspected the understanding was going to take longer than one career, and that exactly as it should be. Kale, her former assistant, is the lead now. He's good at it. He still writes things down before I've finished saying them. I walk the Unspoken's corridors most mornings. Shh, there's a rhythm to it now. The research teams have established their stations in the outer sections, and I pass through their work without disrupting it. And the ship's light adjusts around me, in the way that I've come to think of as her version of hello. The patterns move differently when I walk through a corridor than when anyone else does. The research team has documented this, and filed reports about it, and argued about what it means, and I think they're right to argue about it. And I don't have anything to add to the argument except that it feels the way it has always felt. The quality of being attended to by something vast and patient and careful. Sometimes I stop in the central space. Sometimes I stand in the warmth at the center and I say something to the dark. Not the same words every night. It's because it was never the same words. It was the act itself, the maintenance of the thread, presence of a voice in the quiet, so that whatever was listening would know someone was still awake. She never says the 6 words again. She doesn't need to. She said them once, and once was all the occasion required. I know what I am now. I know what my grandmother was, and her mother, and all the voices before them, and the knowing doesn't change what I do. It deepens it. It makes the nightly habit something I do, with full awareness of what I'm holding, instead of a gesture that felt right without knowing why. There is a difference, I have learned, between keeping a watch because you were told to, and keeping a watch because you understand what you're keeping it for. My grandmother kept it the first way, faithfully and without understanding, and that faithfulness is the reason the unspoken is here. The faithfulness of ordinary people doing an ordinary thing in the ordinary dark of ordinary nights, without being told why, without being rewarded for it, without ever knowing what was listening. 60,000 years, one ship, a chain of voices that nobody wrote down. I was 16 years old, and I had nothing. I stood in the cold of the Hevara ring, and I spoke to the dark the way she'd taught me. She'd been listening the whole time.